we do have a very flexible kind of cognition. It's still one of the most, in my mind, interesting frontiers because we have yet to be able to do something like program an artificial intelligence that comes anywhere near the flexibility of human behavior. As hard as the last year and a half has been, think about the way that worldwide people radically change their behavior. Not everybody, but like on the whole, right? People changed their behavior in response to what was effectively a very abstract set of rules. It didn't take years of reinforcement learning or practice or evolution, right? People were just like, okay, I'll start doing this thing now next week. We learned how to grocery shop differently. We learned how to eat differently, socialize differently, work differently, all of this in a moment. And we did it worldwide. And it's a really amazing function that no other species and no AI yet built can even come close to. And I think that's what makes it it's an exciting area of science because it's such a mystery how we do it.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast that explores how recent discoveries in neuroscience are unraveling the mystery of how our brain makes us human. This is episode 190, and I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Today's episode is brought to you by the American Academy of Neurology. My guest today is David Badre. David is a professor of cognitive linguistics and psychological sciences at Brown University, and he is the author of On Task: How Our Brain Gets Things Done. The ability to plan and carry out a wide variety of tasks is a truly unique human ability. The emphasis of our conversation will be on the practical implications of learning exactly how the brain gets things done. For the sake of new listeners, I want to remind you that you can get complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com, and you can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. You can get the show notes automatically each month when you sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter. All you have to do is text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. When you sign up, you will also get a free handout called 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. Because Brain Science is independently produced, it relies on the support of listeners like you. You can learn more about this at brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. I'll be back after the interview with a few brief announcements and a review of today's key ideas. Welcome, David Badre, to Brain Science. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this.
So I'm looking forward to talking about your book, On Task: How Our Brain Gets Things Done. But first, I'd like to start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself, including how you got interested in neuroscience and especially the field of cognitive control.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a professor of cognitive linguistic and psychological sciences at Brown University. And so my main area of interest and focus is in the brain, and specifically on this topic of cognitive control and executive function. I came to cognitive control probably in a little bit of a serendipitous way, as we often do in science in terms of who we're studying with. I actually started out in graduate school interested in memory primarily. I was focused on how we remember and how we learn, and how we retrieve information from memory when we need it. And that when we need it bit is what started to really capture my interest, because I found more and more I was interested in how people decide they need some information and they use it in what they're doing. And that turned out, kind of led me down the path of thinking more and more about control processes. And by the end of my graduate work, I was really pursuing core problems in cognitive control with memory as a focus, so cognitive control of memory. But that was really what took me that direction. And then I ended up, for my postdoctoral work, going into a lab that was focused on working memory and cognitive control and so forth.
Would you mind just giving us, because your book is really detailed, a brief overview of the book?
Sure. So the book focuses on the science and the neuroscience underlying this function called cognitive control. So I called it How We Get Things Done. And that's because really that's what this function is all about. Humans have other species do as well, but humans really have a remarkable ability to conceive of different kinds of tasks, plans, goals. We can invent new norms, new policies, and then we can construct tasks and actions that allow us to achieve those goals. And we can even do that with tasks we've never really done before. And in fact, I mean, there's no better demonstration of that than the last year and a half or so, right? I mean, most of us were not wearing masks regularly or distancing 6 feet and things like that. And yet we were able to do that, many of us relatively quickly, right? And the reason we can do that based on abstract rules that we were told by public health officials. And the reason we can do that is because we have this set of functions that allow us to connect what we know with how we behave. So, I mean, we know we're flexible. We know we're an intelligent species. Just what we don't often appreciate is this function of cognitive control. So really the book is about that function, right? It's how we link knowledge and action and all of its many facets, ranging from investigating, obviously, how we do complex tasks, but also things like multitasking, remembering, stopping ourselves from doing things, and then also how control changes over our lifespans, both as children or as we become independent adults, and also how it changes as we age.
Would it be reasonable to give a simple definition that cognitive control is the systems that we have for bridging the gap between our goals and our actions?
Yeah, and I like that definition because it does recognize that knowledge and action are distinct things to some degree, and so knowing is not enough. You have to be able to bridge from what you want to do to how you behave, and that gap is not trivial. It's not easy. You actually need a class of functions in the brain to bridge it, and that's what cognitive control is all about.
I copied it from the book, so I mean, it's not like I made it up. Because people have probably heard a lot of different ideas, perhaps we should just briefly overview some of the things that have developed in the field. I mean, like we started out with thinking prefrontal lobes didn't matter and so forth. Could you take us through just a brief overview of this field, how it's developed?
I'll start by, you mentioned the frontal lobes, and I think the part of the brain that we associate the most with cognitive control is the frontal lobe, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is the most frontal part of the frontal lobe, redundantly named. These days, it's pretty wide. I think it's even reached maybe conventional wisdom that the prefrontal cortex is important in some way for intelligence, for higher cognition, and for thinking and planning. And that actually was the attitude in the earliest, like in the 19th century, they had these ideas too, that maybe that was the seat of intelligence and things. Early on, when neuroscientists started who were, for instance, running experiments with animals, would do things like lesion parts of the prefrontal cortex to see what function was disrupted. Or if you had patients that had, due to, say, accident or injury, would have procedures that resected or removed parts of the prefrontal cortex. The really widespread observation was they didn't seem to be a clear function that was lost. And that was in real contrast to other functions that we know about, things like perception or language. Some of the most famous early cases of aphasics who couldn't speak after damage to the brain, right, really said, there's a language function in this part of the brain. But when you remove the prefrontal cortex, there wasn't a clear thing that was lost. And in fact, some of these patients seemed to be almost normal in their interactions with their doctors, for example. They'd be able to carry out conversations. They didn't have a seeming problem based on the kinds of clinical or neuropsychological tests that were being given at the time. Yeah, it wasn't clear that it had a specific function. It was a functionless cortex to some degree. And that, of course, wasn't the case. It is actually really crucial, but it's crucial for this abstract linking function, this bridge between knowledge and action that's harder to define scientifically. And so where they expressed that was in their everyday lives. So in terms of their ability to carry out complex sequential tasks, to manage the complexity of our world, with all the different goals and things we have to manage and information that impinges on us, and that we have to do things in the midst of all of that mess, that's where they would really struggle. And so the contrast to the clinic was pretty striking. And it wasn't really until probably we started getting a strong concept of what was at that time called executive function or cognitive control in the 50s and 60s that we started to appreciate that really seemed to be a function that was lost in these patients.
And then later on, we began to appreciate that the prefrontal lobes couldn't do everything on their own. It's all about networks and who talks to who, right?
That's right. Yeah. So as I said earlier, the part of the brain most associated with cognitive control is prefrontal cortex, but we now know that it's not really just the prefrontal cortex, that there are whole networks that are important for control with neurons and most lobes and all lobes of the brain that interact with each other to perform these complex functions. It's far more dynamic.
So we are going to be exploring some of those key ideas that are in your book, but I wouldn't be spoiling anything because we've already alluded to the fact that the prefrontal lobes are important, and people are now aware that the prefrontal lobes are the last part of the brain to mature. So I sort of want to skip to something you talk about later in the book, which is this maturation of cognitive control and how that works. I like your anti-Death Star approach. Would you talk about that?
Sure. So what I call the Death Star model of cognitive control development is, I think it's characteristic of some popularized ideas about the way that the brain works. And so I'll back up and say it starts actually with some correct premises, right? One is that, as you mentioned, the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex in particular takes a long time to develop. It's still maturing well into the late teens, and up to mid 20s. Actually, you can still get plasticity in that part of the brain. So it takes a long time to mature. And likewise, in terms of children's behavior, as they progress into adolescence, that cognitive control function isn't as strong among kids, right? Anybody who's spent any time with children knows that they're wonderful, but they also are fairly disinhibited. They show a lot of characteristic signs you might think of not exhibiting cognitive control. We could talk about those for a while. But the sort of Death Star model, though, draws from those two, I think, correct observations an incorrect inference about the nature of development. Their view is it's sort of like the building of a Death Star. There's this inexplicable process. It's not clear why it takes so long. It just takes a long time because it's complicated. And so as a result, it takes a very long time for the frontal lobes to develop. Cognitive control doesn't come online until it's this sort of fully operational battle station. And then any environmental effects that you encounter early in your life really only serve like a swarm of invading starships, rebel starships, to basically destroy that normal process of development and to throw your executive function off and prevent it from developing in a healthy way. The problem, though, is that this doesn't provide an account of why it takes so long. And I think it treats the nature environmental input in ways that aren't inconsistent with what we know from the science. So rather than thinking of cognitive control as something that comes on later in life when the frontal lobes have fully developed, and that there's just this inextricable process that it develops in time, right, on its own program. Rather, we should think about the way cognitive control develops as an active process of taking input from the environment and optimizing our control accordingly. What we're doing is we need control in order to behave in our world. And our worlds are variable places with lots of different kinds of information. And so experience and input from the environment is the best teacher for that kind of system. Basically, control systems need data. They need data to optimize what they're doing. And so we spend really that first 10 to 15 or longer years of our lives collecting that data and optimizing that system. So the system is developing as an active process, right? And the environment is not just a source of bad things that can happen to us, though there surely are bad things that can happen that will cause problems for our cognitive control system. Much of it is a source of input, of information for the system that drives that developmental process and drives that maturational process towards the way that we control ourselves as we get older.
So our cognitive control system becomes customized by our own personal experience.
Exactly. And in fact, that's a really important thing. What happens in that early part of our lives, because it's almost like a statistical sample, right, taken by the brain, is saying, this is a good sample of what the world is going to be like during my life. So let me optimize my control system on that basis so that I can control myself as I move forward.
So what are the implications of this for parenting?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think there's several of them. I think one thing that we should recognize right away is that children do have the capacity to engage in self-control. So control doesn't come on late in life, right? Yes, it is the case that they'll run out the door with 2 different socks and forgetting their coat, but it's also the case that they can exhibit the ability to generate rules and plans and to control themselves. But moreover, it's really important that we give them the opportunity to try to control themselves and to succeed and to safely to fail doing so, because that's how the brain learns. I have 2 kids, school-age children, and the temptation in so many cases is to do the thing for them. Kids these days have a million activities, and you've got school, and then you have piano and soccer practice. So, you're going to need your piano bag, you're going to need your cleats, you're going to need your books and homework and all of this. And so the temptation as a parent is just you pack the bag for them, you get all that all set up and make sure, because if you don't, they're going to forget something and that won't be good. But the flip side of that is they're not learning Their brain isn't having the chance to set that goal, to plan in advance and go through that process themselves of how they structure their actions, right, in advance of what's coming. So it's really important to give them chances to be autonomous and give them chances to control themselves so they can learn. And as I say, to even in the chance that they can fail, as long as it's safe, that failure errors are a big way that we learn because we can use that as information for the next time.
I still remember losing a package when I was about 5 years old because I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing with it, and I was with my mother. She was probably upset that I lost the package, but on the other hand, I don't think I ever did that again.
Yeah, because you had that experience.
Yeah, you learn from experience, and yeah. So that's the reason why I wanted to ask this up front, because I really think it's important that we bring this stuff down to real life and how can we use it in real life. And that was something in the book that stood up for me. The Neurology Minute delivers 1 to 2 minute daily briefings on what you need to know in the field of neurology, the latest science focused on the brain, and timely topics explored by leading neurologists and neuroscientists. From the American Academy of Neurology, the Neurology Minute is hosted by Dr. Stacy Clardy with contributions from experts from neurology journals, Neurology Today, and more. In the most recent Neurology Minute, learn about neurological outcome prediction in the intensive care unit. Find the Neurology Minute wherever you get your podcasts. David, why is it that right now we don't really have an accepted theory of cognitive control?
Part of it is because there are a lot of challenges in studying this particular function. For one, we've had a lot of trouble over the years defining it. As I mentioned, unlike things like memory and vision and language for which we have an intuition, what we mean by them. When you dive down under the surface, as I'm sure if you've talked to scientists who study those, they can be really hard to define too. But that being said, we have an intuition for them that we don't really have about control. It took scientists a long time even to realize that we needed to posit something between knowledge and action. That it wasn't enough just that for someone knows the rule, they can do it, that they had to actually, even simple rules, like press this button when you see a red square on the screen, seems like a really simple thing to do, but that requires some class of processes to translate that. That's one reason that it's hard. But there are also just some fundamental hard problems that you have to try to address theoretically when you're trying to deal with something like control. Just to give one example, right, is what's called sometimes the curse of dimensionality, the fact that we have lots and lots and lots of information that we process around us all the time in our world, and yet we're able to somehow make sense of all that and to act on it. And from a theoretical perspective, it's very hard to address that. A lot of the models and the theories we produce are based on laboratory experiments where we can control everything, because that's what we need to do to make sure we can reproduce things and understand them. And they lend themselves to theory. But when we try to boil them up to the complexity of our world, it gets very hard. And the problem is that, for example, patients that would show problems in the complexity of the real world because they lack cognitive control might be fine on that simple task. So you need to have a way of not just theorizing about that function, but how it scales up to the complexity of our world, because that's the niche in which cognitive control exists. So that's just one example, but there are many other of these kinds of obstacles that scientists face when they're trying to study this function.
Because real life is very open-ended.
You don't know the rule.
It's opposite from an experiment.
Exactly. I mean, our goals can be open-ended. Even the big ones can be. I want to go to college or something. That's a very open-ended goal. But also even just I want to have lunch. Until you kind of, unless you've planned it out perfectly, you could be generating that as you go, especially if you say you're traveling, you don't know where's the lunch places near here. You got to set a plan to try to find something and then revise it as you go. It's an incredibly dynamic process.
So one of the things that I would think would also be a challenge in studying this would just be the fact that you've got so much overlap with other functions such as learning and so on. So I was wondering if you would talk about the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and working memory.
Working memory, I think, first off, just to give a quick definition, because it can mean different things to different people. So working memory is distinct from other forms of memory in that it's meant to be an active form of memory that's typically limited in its capacity. We can only hold a few number of things at a given time in our working memory. It's associated with attention and consciousness. We're aware of them. And they're readily available for manipulating them and so forth and working on them. So they're more than just, say, a short-term memory, which would be just information available for a short period of time. Working memory also adds to it this ability to manipulate the information. For instance, if I was doing a mental math without the benefit of paper, so I'm holding these numbers in mind, I'm able to manipulate them, engage in transformations in my head, and I do that using my working memory. So working memory, though, is really central to at least current conceptions of cognitive control, because almost anytime you're talking about control, you're using some internal information. That's a context, a goal, whatever it is. You're using that information to guide what you're doing. As one example, right, I came back to my office here at Brown for the first time in a year and a half, about 2 weeks ago, and things look pretty much the same as when I left. So the input to my system, what my senses are seeing, is the same as it's always been. But now when I leave my office, I have to remember to bring my mask with me. I can take that new behavior because I hold in my mind at that time, I make active in my head the fact that I've got these COVID policies I need to think of. My context is COVID, and I use that to choose that action. So I hold that in my working memory, and it allows me to do what I'm doing. Working memory then becomes central to control. It's a source of these internal signals that we can use to affect our behavior and make it so that we're not just driven by what's in our environment, by the associations we have with, I see a piece of a brownie on my desk and I want to eat it, right? That I also can use other information, like, is it, the right time of day? Is it my brownie? Any number of other things, right? I can hold in mind that I can use to select that action. And so working memory itself as a function, as a psychological function, is crucial to control. It's long been associated, though, with the prefrontal cortex, and particularly with the neurons in prefrontal cortex can encode lots of information about what we're doing. Right? They'll fire in different patterns depending on the task we're in, including these internal signals about the goal I have and my overall context, something that's and that can be sustained over time. And so it can hold effectively information, even if it's left the senses, over time that's relevant to our task, much like a task-based working memory. And so that's why we often think that the contribution of the prefrontal cortex specifically, and as opposed to other parts of the frontal lobes, may be crucial for that maintenance of information that we need for control, for working memory, basically.
But it's actually part of a bigger or larger control system, right? The prefrontal cortex doesn't work alone.
That's right. And in fact, even working memory it doesn't depend strictly on that, right? Depending on the kind of information you're maintaining, the prefrontal cortex is influencing other parts of the brain that may actually also encode that information in order to keep them active. And so by doing that, by eliciting those kinds of dynamics, it can maintain a particular brain state over a period of time more broadly.
Right. And so that's the reason why when we repeat a phone number or something to ourselves out loud, it's easier to remember because we're engaging other parts of the brain?
Well, yeah, exactly. If you're repeating a phone number, you're using that as a way of maintaining something. It's a good way of recruiting other systems. If you're doing it out loud, you're using a motor system and everything else to maintain that information. And so it's benefiting. And that's a good analogy, even if it's not something as explicit as that kind of strategy. It's a good analogy to the way that the prefrontal cortex can elicit other processes to help aid memory.
So in looking at what is involved in cognitive control, one of the themes that runs through your book is the issue of, or the trade-off between stability and flexibility. Could you talk about that a little?
So stability and flexibility they have what's called a computational trade-off. That means that if I have a single system that I build, things I do to that system to make it more stable, to not change due to environmental, other kinds of inputs, make it less flexible, make it harder to shift into new things, and vice versa. And so I give an example, for instance, in the book. If I'm in my office working on my computer, writing a paper or grant or something, whatever scientists do, right? I'm sitting there working away. I have a Mac, and I have a Mac Mail icon in my taskbar, and every time I get a new message, it's going to increment that taskbar like by one. So I can see basically in real time my emails slowly accumulating. Right, that's a really salient cue to another task that I don't need to be doing right now. I need to be focusing on writing my paper. So if I have good stability, I can resist that tendency to want to shift to that task. However, I don't want to be so stable that if something more important comes along, I can't shift to it. For example, if one of my graduate students were to come into my office and say, hey, the servers are melting down and we're losing all of our data, I don't want to be doggedly working on my paper. I want to be able to shift my attention and do this new task because that came along. So I want to also be able to be flexible. And you can imagine then you can get an intuition then for how that balance needs to be struck. You want to be stable to some things and flexible when you need to be. And so because it's a computational trade-off, it's hard to do that within one system. But what the brain can do, and again, coming back to the interactions you mentioned between prefrontal cortex and other structures, interactions between the prefrontal cortex and another brain structure called the basal ganglia, which is deep in the frontal lobes, subcortically, can enact that trade-off by dividing labor, by primarily assigning the sort of stability side to the prefrontal cortex and the flexibility side down to the basal ganglia.
Is that where the idea of gating comes in? Could you talk a little bit about how that works?
Of course, yeah. So we already talked about why working memory is important for control, right? That we have to be able to hold things that are rules and plans and ideas we have that are important to influence our behavior. We want to keep them in mind. That becomes really important. But you don't want to keep everything in mind always. Working memory is capacity limited. We can only hold a few things at once, for one thing. And so you don't want stuff that's just irrelevant to be stuck in your head, right? I felt like I was doing a lot of that back during the pandemic period because, we had our children at home and my wife and I are trying to work, and there's a lot of information coming in at us all the time that we didn't want to hold in our working memory. So you need to be able to first choose what things do you put into memory, what things you don't. You also have to make choices about, of the things you're holding in memory, what to do when, for any complex task you're doing. And by complex, I can mean tasks we think of as mundane, like making a cup of coffee is the example I give a lot in the book, right? There's a lot of moving parts to that task. You have to select when to allow this bit of information to work versus that bit of information to work. So again, you need some way of managing what's in memory. So the notion of a gate is a metaphor that kind of captures that idea. When a gate is closed, it doesn't let information into memory, or it doesn't let information out of memory for a particular channel. But if you open it, you can either allow information to be maintained, or if it's already in memory, you can allow that information to influence behavior. That's the notion of a gate. And so a lot of our current evidence suggests that, whereas the cortex is important for holding that information, right? The cortical networks are holding information in mind. They interact with the basal ganglia to enact the gate. That the basal ganglia allows you to flexibly update what's in mind, and put something new in there that wasn't there before, or to flexibly change what you're doing, to allow something new to influence your behavior that wasn't doing it before. So the gate kind of allows you to be more flexible, whereas the prefrontal cortex is interested in robustly maintaining information.
Would you talk about where these gates came from? I mean, in terms of the motor origins.
Sure, yeah. This is, I think, an interesting aspect of these ideas about the basal ganglia. So the basic structures in the basal ganglia are shared among all vertebrates. We actually, in terms of the comparative anatomy, you find a similar kind of system set up in the lamprey, which shares its ancestor with the rest of vertebrates something like 40 million years ago. So it's a highly conserved structure. And what it does is, that basic conserved structure is it allows for motor plans. That means movements. It's not sufficient for the movement to be that neurons, say, in the part of the brain called motor cortex that program the movement, set the movement in action. Those cells are not driven enough initially to actually drive action. Rather, they can come active. You need an additional boost of drive from the basal ganglia to actually make the movement through this sort of complex called disinhibitory loop, right, that keeps it from happening. And it's a really important function. The reason why it's so well conserved is that it effectively allows a creature that has this system to set up an action without actually doing it. And you can think of any number of reasons that would be important. Just even say you're a predator, you can get your pounce programmed and ready to go before your prey hops by, right? And then time exactly when you want to act. Not to mention that if it's not quite the right action, it gives you a chance to replan it. Basically, it just allows us to think of actions without just doing them, which is pretty useful. And again, that's shared among many, many species. What's perhaps more unique among primates, and particularly among humans, is that this system is very highly elaborated. You don't see this basal ganglia loop with motor cortex. You also see it out into the prefrontal cortex. And so there, it's not withholding actions, right, until they get driven. It's effectively doing the same thing on memories, specifically working memories. So if I'm holding in mind some idea about a particular goal or sub-goal that I need to do, I can time exactly when that sub-goal is allowed to start influencing my action. And so by elaborating that system that initially evolved for motor control up to now control of memory, you have a system for cognitive control that very quickly can do complex types of tasks that have multiple goals and sub-goals.
Are you looking for a special gift for this holiday season? I want to take a moment to tell you about Storyworth, an online service that helps you and your loved ones share and preserve precious memories. Every week for a year, Storyworth sends your loved one a thought-provoking question to help stimulate their memory. Often these questions are things that you would never think to ask, like what was the bravest thing you ever did? They can also change to a different question whenever they want. At the end of the year, the stories are compiled into a beautiful book that can be shared with future generations. I have a friend whose son gave her Storyworth, and she is really enjoying sharing her stories in this way. With Storyworth, you are giving those you love most a thoughtful personal gift from the heart and preserving their memories and stories for years to come. Go to storyworth.com/brain and save $10 off your first purchase. That's storyworth.com/brain to save $10 on your first purchase. How does this solve that whole stability, flexibility problem?
Well, there's a couple ways that it can address it. So if I have a gate, so the maintenance system within the prefrontal cortex is able to maintain this information in time. Okay, so let's say that I want to maintain my task goal of working on my paper. We're being a little bit cartoonish, but just imagine that I want to write my paper goal sort of going around in these recurrent networks in my prefrontal cortex, and it's being held there after I've thought of it. And that's controlling my behavior. And along comes some salient distractor, like my Mac mail icon or what have you. By keeping my gate closed, not allowing that into my working memory, I don't run the risk of that replacing my goal in working memory or having a chance of driving my action. So effectively, by keeping the gate closed, the maintenance loop maintains stability. If, however, now my graduate student runs in the room to tell me about these servers melting down, I can open my gate, put that new goal into my working memory, and now I've enacted some flexibility. And so those dynamics then between the cortex and the basal ganglia is a way to address this problem. And maybe we'll get to it, but part of what that asks is how does it know when is it time to open the gate and when it isn't time to open the gate? That's a pretty hard problem. And we have some ideas about that too, based on the value of doing so, either opening or not.
So what's the status of this theory? Does it have a lot of empirical support behind it?
It does. So it's there's, as with any sort of theory in this domain, right, there's lots of different ways you need to try to test it. And I think this is still an ongoing area of science right now. And there's definitely debate. There are other ideas about gating that are not mutually exclusive with this one, that you could have gating through cortical interactions of interneurons, for example. But there is good evidence coming from a variety of different sources, right? What we consider called convergent evidence. What we often have in science, right, at least when you're doing science at this level, is that there's no one experiment that gets you everything you need. Every one has significant limitations. And so one thing we like to see is evidence from lots of different sources that have different limitations, because then you get this sort of convergence around a particular theme. So this has some convergent evidence of that type. I mean, we know things about the gating dynamics, at least motor gating dynamics in animals, that seem to drive a lot of this theory. We can see in humans from data using, say, neuroimaging methods like fMRI, we know that interactions between the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex support gating. We have evidence from patients that showed problems with these types of functions when they have damage to these parts of the brain. We have evidence from things like pharmacology where we know the neurotransmitter systems that we think are involved. For instance, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's very important for this basal ganglia gating system, where we can predict behavioral outcomes based on that. And I could go on, but there is a lot of evidence, but it's an ongoing area of research, and we're still learning as we go.
David, what about multitasking?
Multitasking, of course, is something that hopefully people have gotten the message by now. It was for a while, I feel like multitasking, there's all this stuff about how do you multitask better? Who are good multitaskers? Put multitasking on your resume or whatever. And then I feel like there was a good pushback from the scientific community pointing out that nobody's good at multitasking. Like in general, multitasking is, you're always going to do worse when you multitask. If I were to do two separate tasks, one at a time, continuously until I was done, I will be more efficient than if I try to do those two tasks together. That's just always going to be the case. I'm going to be slower and less accurate when I try to do them together. I think the interesting question, and to some degree we tackle in the book as well, though, is to ask, it is the case we can multitask some things. So we can do the proverbial walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So the question is, why is it that we can multitask some things like that, but we can't multitask? I can't simultaneously write my grant and do my child's math or check my child's math homework, which I learned this last year I can't do together, right? I can't do that simultaneously. Why not, right? Why shouldn't that just become gum chewing and walking? And that's where cognitive control theory can help us understand a bit.
Does it have to do with trying to access the same resources?
That's a big piece of it. It kind of starts with where we began this discussion with our flexibility, right? The fact that we can do just about any task we can conceive of. That's the benefit of our system, of our control system, that we can kind of assemble these tasks. But if you think of the way we do that as we're able to assemble tasks out of simpler parts, right? You have like a library of little bits that you've accumulated over those years of development and everything else. When you're given a new goal, you can construct that task on the fly. So that's great. But the downside is that those common elements are going to be shared by lots of tasks. An analogy to a traffic system is pretty good. Most towns will build a road system that allows you to go from any location in town to any other location in town. That's really important. But they don't do that by building a devoted street from every location to every other street, right? That'd be pretty inefficient and expensive. Rather, they have like common roads that we all go to and then we go down. But the downside on that is everybody uses them, and so you have traffic. So you have slowing and you have delays. And it's a very similar case, right, for what happens with our control system when you're multitasking, right? You have two tasks. Again, you use this flexible system to build up these two tasks using common roads. You can think of each task as a route driven between two locations in this town that you'd never driven before. You could do them, but if you did them at the same time, it'd be like cars trying to go down both. You'd end up with delays and interference because they're using that shared pathway. And so that's the problem with multitasking.
So you did have one, I would say, practical thing in there about in the real world, things we could do to avoid task interference. Would you talk about that, since I think that's something people can use in real life?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one thing is to try to, as much as possible, separate the context between tasks, right? Because often multitasking costs come about not because we're actually trying to multitask, but because we've done another task recently, or we're even in an environment where we do lots of tasks, because they bring to mind, it's sort of like my Mac icon popping up on the screen, but in this case, it's just elicited in memory, and it's enough to cause some interference, right? These are what are called switch costs are caused by that. When I go from one task to the other, I get these delays. So one thing you can do is to try to have your context related to the task you're doing only, right, in a one-to-one way, and as much as possible. If there's a particular hard task you're doing, if there's like a particular time of day you always do it, a particular location, right, and even the surroundings are the same, that can really help to separate that task from other tasks that you're doing and make it easier for you to both start doing it, retrieve the information you need for it, and reduce those multitasking costs. Of course, it's hard. We don't have a separate office for every task we ever needed to do, or a separate place. In fact, we have quite the opposite. Most offices are heavy multitask environments.
But you could turn off the counter of your email so that you're not being distracted by it.
You could. You can even use, I do, in fact, hide my Mac icons. I'll even use different desktops for different tasks within my multiple desktop on the computer, things like that. To some degree, what that does is it allows it so that your control system doesn't have to internally keep you, say you're doing this task, this is the context I'm in, because otherwise the input's exactly the same. It allows you to use your environment a little bit to help you control yourself.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Definitely not.
I want to take a moment to mention our longtime sponsor, TextExpander. TextExpander allows you to use snippets to avoid repetitive typing. I use it for everything from short signatures to full-length emails. Best of all, you can use it on any platform, Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPad, iOS, and you can share your snippets across device or with team members. Brain Science listeners can get 20% off their first year. Just visit textexpander.com/podcast to learn more about TextExpander. That's textexpander.com/podcast for 20% off your first year. And be sure to tell them that you learned about it on Brain Science. What about stopping?
Yeah, stopping is often sometimes referred to as inhibition, or our ability to stop ourselves from doing something we don't want to do is obviously a really important aspect of control. In fact, probably if you were to ask people their sort of intuition of what self-control would be, their example would often be something related to stopping, like keeping myself from eating cake, keeping myself from doing things I don't want to, being impulsive about what I'm doing. So stopping is obviously is closely tied to control. It's interesting that there's been a long debate about how many cases of stopping are actually stopping that are actually involve in inhibitory processes and a mental process by which I take something that I wanted to do. I wanted to reach out and eat that brownie on my desk. I don't know why I have this example. I don't have brownies on my desk routinely, but anyway, if I want to reach, I see that brownie, I want to go grab it. But there's some process, in fact, I even elicit the response to go grab it, but then some process pulls me back and stops me from doing that. That's a notion of an inhibitory process. But that's not necessarily the case. A lot of cases of us not doing something or slowing down have nothing to do with an actual stopping process, but rather are due to other kinds of processes that aren't really inhibitory. Traffic is a good example, right? If I can not eat the brownie by choosing to do something else. Like I can choose to focus on my email or something, and that's not an inhibitory process per se. But there are actual inhibitory processes. There's a system, again, involving the frontal lobe, but other areas of the brain as well that are involved in actual inhibition or stopping.
So you did mention in the book that when somebody does something impulsive, it doesn't necessarily mean a failed inhibitory process. Like when someone has frontal lobe damage, that can be affecting monitoring and motivation and even just being able to set up the tasks.
Exactly, right. You're putting yourself in setting up a task the wrong way, right, such that it ends up eliciting a response, right, as opposed to not eliciting a response or eliciting the wrong response. Or it could be that you didn't make the decision not to go, for example. There's any number of things that aren't inhibitory per se that would look like inhibition.
Would you address the issue of whether or not cognitive control is a mental resource that can be depleted?
This is a really important question, I think, not just for control, but our concept of the human mind. There's long been an idea, a strain of thinking in psychology that we have a single resource of mental efficacy of some type. And moreover, with a metaphor to like a muscle, it's depletable. So in other words, it's a pool of mental resources, and if we use them a lot, they'll be depleted and our efficacy goes down accordingly. And probably one of the strongest sources of evidence over the years, or one of the most, I should say, commonly cited sources of evidence over the years for that come from experiments on so-called ego depletion, whereby you give an experimental participant a difficult task to do, like you have them resist eating brownies on their desks for a while. And then you follow that with another task that involves mental effort that's very different. You give them anagrams to solve, and you don't tell them that the anagrams aren't really solvable. And you just see how long it takes before they give up, for example. The observation from these experiments was that people who had done the hard task first tended to give up faster or showed less mental efficacy, and this was generalized to lots of different kinds of tasks. However, in recent years, the evidence for that hasn't been as strong in terms of both the evidence in the literature as being as consistent as was previously thought and has been called into question. And further, direct attempts to replicate have not been very successful. It has called into question in general the experimental support for something like a central resource. But there's also just in terms of the general logic of it, right, the analogy to the muscle, it's really not clear that it's a good one. If I'm lifting a weight, over time, no matter how much I want to lift that weight, I won't be able to. The muscle fatigues enough that I just can't do it. That's not the case. If I gave you math problems to do, if you wanted to do a math, you'll be sick of math problems. I mean, there'll be a point where you don't want to do another math problem. But if you want to do a math problem, you can always do another math problem. And so it's not the case that there's no real strong evidence that there's a depletion of mental resources in the same, at least catastrophic way that you see with, let's say, a muscle, for example.
Yeah, you gave an example. I don't remember the name of the person who tried this and did something really tedious for like 4 days or some crazy amount.
Yeah, this was actually a graduate student. So it's a classic study from a graduate student who was at Columbia at the time. And she had basically took math, this is for her dissertation work, did math problems over and over again. So they trained herself basically to do these like 4-digit multiplication problems. She had a way of randomizing, like drawing out numbers out of a bag or something. And then she would look at the number, close her eyes, do the 4-digit multiplication problem, write down the answer, and then she'd do the next one. And on a timer. So she did it very systematically in her head. And after she had trained herself, she'll do this consistently. She then basically spent 4 days from morning until night with only some breaks for meals, basically just doing those problems. Morning till night. And she like sort of also wrote down her experiences on the way. And so what was striking about that experiment, that initial demonstration, and it was actually later replicated in the 40s, or some more scientists did the same thing, and it's been replicated since then, was that there was no evidence of a decline in efficacy. It was certainly the case there was a decline in motivation. She described it to the point of feeling nausea, like the idea of doing another math problem. But in terms of like the efficacy, mental efficacy, there was no evidence of a decline. So if there was a central resource, that level of mental work, it's hard to imagine a mental resource if it wasn't depleted by would be meaningfully depleted from the kinds of small decisions we make or a small mental effort that we take from day to day.
So that takes away some favorite excuse we might like to use. But why we do bad things after we've worked a long shift. Okay, well, David, we have only barely scratched the surface of your fantastic book. What are the main implications, as far as you're concerned, of what you've learned about cognitive control?
To come back, I think, to this idea that knowledge and action are separate, because I think it is something that we often forget or don't recognize, that it's not enough that people know something, even if they believe it like firmly. They need to be put in a position where they can construct the actions to do it. And there can often be limitations in that second step for a variety of reasons. And so I think understanding that about ourselves, understanding that even about our society, it adds another dimension to the way we think about our behavior, about behavior change, about the way that our society can operate. But the flip side is, too, it allows us to recognize that we do have a very flexible kind of cognition. It's still one of the most, in my mind, interesting frontiers, because we have yet to be able to do something like program an artificial intelligence that comes anywhere near the flexibility of human behavior. As hard as the last year and a half has been, think about the way that worldwide people radically change their behavior. Not everybody, but like on the whole, right? People change their behavior in response to what was effectively a very abstract set of rules. It didn't take years of reinforcement learning or practice or evolution, right? People were just like, okay, I'll start doing this thing now next week. We learned how to grocery shop differently. We learned how to eat differently, socialize differently, work differently, all of this in a moment. And we did it worldwide. And it's a really amazing function that no other species and no AI yet built can even come close to. And I think that's what makes it's an exciting area of science, because it's such a mystery how we do it.
What else would you like to share before we close?
I don't have anything really to add. We did cover a wide range there in that discussion, so that was great.
Well, I'm certainly going to encourage people to read the book, both for the parts we didn't talk about and all the great experiments that you explained, and there's just a lot of stuff there. The question I usually ask my guests at the end is, what advice do you have for students interested in neuroscience?
Students who are interested in pursuing, at least as a scientific career, I think, be curious and be creative and be open as much as possible. I mentioned kind of serendipity at the beginning. Many of us end up kind of along a line of thinking or research because of what we've been doing. I found it very inspiring when students are open to each other in terms of what they're doing, talking about ideas and new models and concepts, even from other fields of study, from engineering or from computer science or what have you, because often those generate new questions for a student as a neuroscientist that they hadn't thought of before. And so I think that's the one thing I suggest, is always be as intellectually open as possible and interdisciplinary as you can.
Absolutely. Just like we can't look at one part of the brain for all the answers, We can't just stick to neuroscience. We got to look at what the rest of the world is doing.
Exactly.
I think about Seth Grant and how he's brought all these tools of molecular biology, and he started out, I think, doing one of his postdocs with Eric Kandel when they first started using the transgenic mice in his lab, and how taking those skills, bringing those skills together have such a big impact. I really appreciate you talking with me today, David.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
All these tools of molecular biology, and he started out, I think, doing one of his postdocs with Eric Kandel when they first started using the transgenic mice in his lab, and how taking those skills, bringing those skills together have such a big impact. I really appreciate you talking with me today, David.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
I want to thank David Badre for taking the time to talk with us about his book, On Task: How Our Brain Gets Things Done. Of course, we barely scratched the surface during our brief conversation. On Task contains a detailed review of the research, including a discussion of how work in artificial intelligence and computational neuroscience has influenced the design of experiments. For example, if you want to know why he rejects the idea of willpower as a limited resource, please read the book and evaluate the evidence for yourself. This book contains information for listeners of all backgrounds, but today we focused on the practical implications of this work. Before I review the key ideas, I need to share a couple of things. As many of you know, I'm not very active on social media like Facebook, but I appreciate how important word of mouth is in reaching new listeners. One trend that has surprised me is the growing number of people listening on YouTube. That's the reason Mel from Australia is creating short video excerpts. I hope you'll check these out and share them with others. They're easy to find on YouTube by searching with the term Brain Science Podcast. I also appreciate your feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. I need to take a moment to explain the difference between Premium and Patreon, starting with a focus on episode transcripts. There are 3 ways to get episode transcripts. You can buy individual transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. Premium subscribers pay a set monthly rate for unlimited access to every episode and every transcript. Patreon allows you to make a monthly pledge that meets your budget. If your pledge is at least $3 a month, you get a new transcript every month. If you pledge at least $10, you get ad-free audio. I hope this clears up the confusion. If you want to learn more, go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations, or don't hesitate to email me if you still have questions. So back to the book. David's book, On Task: How Our Brain Gets Things Done, is an in-depth review of the current scientific understanding of cognitive control. Humans appear to have a unique ability to both plan and execute plans. The brain circuits that make this possible must constantly make trade-offs between stability and flexibility. But thankfully, we can continue to learn and adapt throughout our lives. During the interview, I tried to focus on the practical implications rather than the detailed neuroscience. So I want to remind you that all the detail and references you could possibly want are in the book. One of the ideas that really stood out for me was the role of learning in cognitive control. We learn cognitive control through experience. This is a critical idea for parents and teachers. Cognitive control has many elements, including working memory, so it's no wonder that it fails during neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and even schizophrenia. I've often talked about why multitasking is impossible. The evidence is reviewed in this book, and David makes practical suggestions about helping our brain rather than hindering it with distracting cues. The word willpower was not mentioned, but I did ask him to talk about the latest evidence that shows that cognitive control is not the limited resource that some theories claim. The key idea is that cognitive control is what allows us to plan and carry out tasks, even the ones that appear simple, and it allows us to adapt to new situations, like learning to wear masks during the COVID pandemic. Cognitive control changes over our lifespan, and we talked about why experience plays an important role in developing cognitive control, but we didn't have a chance to discuss what happens later in life. That's in the book. Another important idea about cognitive control is that is how we bridge the gap between plans and action. Oftentimes, people who have damage to these circuits can make a plan, but they can't necessarily execute it. There's a lot of neuroanatomy in this book for those who are interested. But I think it's important to remember that cognitive control involves more than just the prefrontal lobes. And there are at least two separate networks involved that connect the prefrontal cortex to other parts of the brain. We talked about the fact that working memory is central to control. And we also talked about the fact that the basal ganglia are involved in gating what information makes it to work in memory. This seems to involve using circuitry that originally evolved to control movement. These are structures that we share with all vertebrates. We didn't get into the specific experimental evidence, but he did talk about the concept of convergent evidence, which is what occurs when a wide variety of experiments seem to point in the same direction. He seems to have assumed that people have gotten the word that multitasking is impossible, which I think might be a little overly optimistic. Aside from the bottlenecks caused by needing to use the same resources, we touched on the importance of environmental cues. This was something he went to in the book that has practical implications. He mentioned how he has these different desktops on his computer to help overcome the fact that it is not possible to have a completely different environment for each task that he needs to do. I encourage you to think creatively about your environment and whether there are steps you can do to minimize distracting cues. This will help your brain stick on one task at a time. What about stopping? Obviously, being able not to do something is also important. Oddly enough, this does not necessarily mean inhibiting neurons from firing. Failures of inhibition of behavior may actually represent failures in monitoring or motivation. In the book, David describes how there is actually a different circuit that creates a global stop signal. He talks about why and where this happens. Again, I encourage you to read the book to learn more. I did ask him to address the influential theory that cognitive control is a limited resource that can be exhausted. Many of you may be familiar with this idea. That's why I felt it was important to introduce the fact that it's not standing up to contemporary research. The details and the references about this are also in the book. In the end, he returned to the importance of the gap between knowing and doing. This can be a challenge both at the individual and the societal level, but he emphasized that we still have incredible flexibility that has not yet been replicated by artificial intelligence. On Task, How Our Brains Get Things Done is a meaty book that is probably going to appeal to people who've been listening to the show for a while, and especially to students and those working in the field. But it is very accessible to anyone who thinks that this is a question that they want to learn more about. Next month, we're going to have the 15th annual review episode. And for those of you who are long-term listeners, you know that the review episode is when I go back over the key ideas from the past year. This has been a really full year of episodes, so I hope that you will enjoy going back and putting the pieces together with me. In the meantime, Until next month, I hope that you will listen to my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Grain Rainbows. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter if you aren't already signed up. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. And please share Brain Science with others. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again next month. Brain Science is copyright 2021 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mind Fire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com. Brain Science is copyright 2021 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mind Fire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.